Jax Thornfield stood at the edge of the Academy's courtyard, his broad shoulders squared against the endless expanse of alien faces passing by. The Intergalactic Academy, floating in the vacuum of space above the planet Zixer, was a place of learning, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. But to Jax, it was little more than a battleground of pride and prejudice. His job as a security guard, though seemingly simple, was far from mundane. It was a position he had taken after leaving behind a life of warfare, a life where every day was spent dodging death on Earth's hostile terrain. Here, among the intergalactic students, the real enemy wasn't a weapon, it was their perception of humans. The Academy's corridors buzzed with conversations in dozens of languages, but one voice cut through the noise, a voice Jax had heard many times before. It was a guttural, mocking tone, laced with arrogance. It belonged to Zhar'tok, the Vrexian, the Academy's self-proclaimed alpha. Jax's instincts flared, and his eyes snapped to the courtyard. There, in the middle of a small crowd, was Zhar'tok, towering over a lone figure, Lyra, a human girl. Jax didn't need to see more to know what was happening. Zhar'tok was a bully. An imposing creature with blue skin and spiny protrusions running down his back, he had a reputation for targeting weaker students, especially humans. To him, Earth was a death world, a joke of a planet filled with primitive creatures. And humans? To Zhar'tok, they were the epitome of weakness, no match for the galactic giants like the Vrexians. Jax clenched his jaw and made his way toward the crowd. His boots hit the ground with a steady thud, drawing the attention of a few nearby students. Word spread quickly, and a hush fell over the courtyard as Jax approached the center of the scene. "You think you can talk in our language, little human?" Zhar'tok's voice echoed, dripping with disdain. Lyra stood in front of him, trembling slightly, her fists clenched at her sides. "You're not even fit to speak our words. Your people can't even control their own planet, let alone understand the greatness of the Vrexian Empire." Lyra didn't flinch. She was new to the Academy, a quiet student from Earth, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. "Maybe not," she said softly, her voice steady, "but I'm here to learn, just like everyone else." Zhar'tok laughed, a low rumbling sound that sent shivers down the spines of the onlookers. "Learn? You can't even begin to understand what you're dealing with, human." Jax reached the edge of the crowd, his towering frame now visible to all. He wasn't trying to be discreet. He wanted to make sure Zhar'tok knew he was watching. As the seconds ticked by, Jax could feel the anger rising in his chest. It wasn't just that Zhar'tok was bullying a fellow human, it was the fact that this bullying was happening in front of others, as if humans were too insignificant to be treated with respect. "Enough," Jax's voice cut through the air, calm and controlled, but firm. Zhar'tok turned to face him, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Jax. The human Deathworlder who had earned a reputation of his own. "And what? You think you can stop me?" Zhar'tok growled, his fists clenching at his sides. The crowd took a step back, sensing the tension in the air. Jax didn't flinch. He didn't need to. He knew what would happen next. "I don't think I need to stop you," Jax replied, his tone cold. "But I'll be damned if I let you keep doing this." Zhar'tok's lips curled into a sneer. "This is none of your business, human. You think just because you've survived on your death world that you're some kind of warrior? You're weak. You don't even belong here." Jax's eyes flicked to Lyra, who was still standing tall, despite the verbal onslaught. He could see her shaking, but she wasn't backing down. Her eyes held a fire that matched his own, a fire born of defiance. "I'll say this once, Zhar'tok," Jax continued, taking a step forward, his presence filling the space between them. "Leave her alone." The Vrexian's face twisted with rage, his muscles rippling as he squared up, stepping closer to Jax. "You think you can stand up to me? I could crush you with one hand." Jax didn't move an inch. He met Zhar'tok's challenge with calm confidence. "You're welcome to try." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The tension was thick, and the students around them exchanged nervous glances. This was the moment everything could spiral out of control. Zhar'tok's hand shot out, grabbing Jax by the collar of his uniform. You'll regret this, human, he snarled. But Jax remained unfazed. With a swift motion, he grabbed Zhar'tok's wrist and twisted it, forcing the Vrection's hand away from his throat. The crowd gasped, watching as Jax effortlessly disarmed the much larger alien. It wasn't about strength, it was about control. You're making a mistake, Jax said, his voice low but firm. Zhar'tok's eyes flickered with something, perhaps fear, perhaps realization, but it was quickly replaced by anger. You'll pay for this. I'll make sure of it. Jax released Zhar'tok's wrist, his grip tightening slightly. If you want to fight, you've got one. But not today. The Vrection snarled, backing away. This isn't over, human, he muttered, his voice dripping with venom. I'll make you regret this. As Zhar'tok turned and stormed off, the crowd dispersed, leaving a quiet hum in the air. Lyra remained rooted to the spot, looking up at Jax with wide eyes. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jax nodded, his gaze lingering on the retreating figure of Zhar'tok. You're welcome. But you should be careful. Some people, he paused, shaking his head. Some people just don't learn. Lyra smiled weakly. I didn't expect that, from him. I thought he was untouchable. Jax's eyes softened for a brief moment. No one is untouchable. Not even Zhar'tok. The words rang in the air, a promise and a warning all at once. Jax knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Not by a long shot. The announcement of the duel spread like wildfire through the academy, igniting whispers in every corner of the station. Jax hadn't been interested in a spectacle, he'd only wanted to stop Zhar'tok from bullying a vulnerable human girl. But now, his name was on the line. And so was humanity's dignity. Jax paced back and forth in his small, sterile quarters. The walls were bare except for a few old military mementos, photos from his days in combat, a tattered flag from Earth. Nothing here was personal. Nothing here was home. He had long since learned to keep his emotions locked down tight, but the idea of facing Zhar'tok again stirred something deep inside him. This wasn't just about winning a fight, it was about sending a message. The Vrection would be relentless. No amount of reasoning would change the arrogance that oozed from his every step. But Jax had learned the hard way that words didn't carry weight in a galaxy where species like the Vrections ruled with muscle and pride. Action was the only language they understood. All right, Jax, no room for mistakes, he muttered to himself, staring at his reflection in the polished mirror. Do this right, or it's all for nothing. He slid his hands into the gloves of his combat suit and took a deep breath. The hallway outside his quarters was quiet, but the distant murmur of students preparing for the duel could be heard. Jax stepped out, making his way toward the arena where he would face Zhar'tok. When he arrived at the open-air arena, a large circle had been cleared, and the surrounding crowd was buzzing with anticipation. The Academy's students, both alien and human, stood along the edges, some eager for the entertainment, others merely curious to see if the human could survive the Vrection's wrath. Zhar'tok stood in the center of the arena, his broad chest puffed out, his yellow eyes gleaming with contempt. He looked every bit the predator, standing head and shoulders above the crowd, his body a mix of muscle and bone. The audience murmured nervously at the sight of him. He was a force of nature, and they all knew it. Jax didn't feel nervous. He was calm. A sense of clarity washed over him as he stepped into the ring. He didn't need to prove his strength, he just needed to outsmart Zhar'tok. The Vrection relied on brute force, on sheer aggression. But Jax had faced much worse back on Earth. He had survived things that would have broken other people. The crowd fell silent as Jax moved into position. Zhar'tok sneered at him, a low growl vibrating in his chest. You're making a mistake, human, Zhar'tok said, his voice laced with venom. I'll break you, piece by piece, until you know your place. Jax didn't respond. He only flexed his hands, rolling his shoulders, preparing for the first move. The referee, a neutral party from the Academy, raised a hand and signaled the start of the duel. The crowd leaned in, breaths held in anticipation. Zhar'tok lunged first, a fast, powerful strike aimed directly at Jax's head. The blow was intended to crush, to overwhelm. But Jax had trained for moments like this, moments when raw power would only hinder, not help. He ducked low, the Vrection's massive fist missing him by mere inches. As he moved, he hooked his arm around Zhar'tok's leg, sweeping it out from under him. The crowd gasped, watching as Zhar'tok staggered but quickly regained his balance. His eyes burned with fury. "You think that'll stop me?" Zhar'tok roared, his voice echoing through the arena. "I'm not trying to stop you," Jax said quietly, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I'm just trying to teach you something." Before Zhar'tok could respond, Jax was already on him, a flurry of movement as he shifted his weight and struck Zhar'tok's midsection. The Vrection stumbled back, clearly thrown off balance, but it wasn't enough to bring him down. Zhar'tok's rage only fueled him more, and he retaliated with a brutal backhand that sent Jax sprawling across the arena. Jax hit the ground hard, but he immediately rolled to his feet, ignoring the sting in his side. The Vrection was too strong, too fast. But Jax wasn't relying on raw power, he was relying on precision. He needed to wear Zhar'tok down, to outlast him. Zhar'tok charged again, this time more methodical, his arms swinging in wide arcs. Jax dodged each blow, weaving through the attacks with practiced ease, but he knew he couldn't keep this up forever. The Vrection's endurance was unmatched. So Jax bided his time, waiting for the right moment. Finally, Zhar'tok overextended, his fist swinging wide in a blind, desperate strike. This was the opening Jax had been waiting for. He darted in, sidestepping the punch and driving his knee into Zhar'tok's ribs. The force of the blow was enough to knock the wind out of the Vrection, sending him stumbling backward, his pride wounded. Zhar'tok growled and lunged at Jax once more, but this time, Jax was ready. He ducked under the Vrection's reach, grabbed Zhar'tok's arm, and twisted it behind his back in a painful lock. The Vrection howled in agony as Jax pulled him into a bear hug, lifting him off the ground and slamming him back onto the arena floor with a resounding crash. The crowd erupted in shock. Zhar'tok was on the ground, gasping for air, his chest heaving. It was clear now, the fight had turned. The once unshakable confidence of the Vrection had been shattered. Jax stood over him, his voice low but clear. "You're done, Zhar'tok. This isn't about strength. It's about knowing when to fight and when to survive." Zhar'tok's yellow eyes glared up at him, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in them now. The mighty bully had been brought low, not by brute force, but by strategy. The Vrection's pride had been wounded, and in that moment, he realized the truth: strength alone was not enough. The referee stepped forward, his expression serious. "Jax Thornfield wins the duel." Jax didn't celebrate. He simply stepped back, allowing the Vrection to rise, acknowledging the lesson that had been delivered. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmurs of disbelief echoing through the arena. Lyra, watching from the sidelines, caught Jax's eye. She gave him a small, grateful smile. Jax nodded back, but there was no satisfaction in the gesture. He had won. But this battle was only the beginning. There would always be others like Zhar'tok, those who believed their strength made them invincible. Jax would continue to show them all that the human spirit was a force they couldn't underestimate. The duel was over, but the war for respect had only just begun. The arena had emptied, leaving behind only echoes of the fight that had unfolded moments ago. Jax stood at its center, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths, his body already beginning to cool from the heat of battle. The dust had settled, and so had the tension that had gripped the academy for the past few days. Zhar'tok had limped off, his pride as battered as his body, but Jax wasn't celebrating. He didn't need to. The Vrection would nurse his wounds, physical and emotional, but there was no real victory for Jax in this. No matter how many fights he won, the galaxy's perception of humanity would not change overnight. Jax turned his back to the arena, the weight of his thoughts pulling him down like gravity. He didn't care about being feared or admired. What mattered now was what happened next. The fight, after all, was just a moment. The real question was whether or not Zhar'tok had learned something. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "You were incredible. Lyra's voice was low, still carrying the shock of the events that had just transpired. Jax glanced over his shoulder, finding her standing just outside the arena's edge, watching him with wide eyes. There was a look of awe on her face, but also something deeper, a quiet understanding that seemed to bridge the gap between them, despite their different backgrounds. "I just did what was necessary," Jax said, his voice level. He had no desire to boast. The fight wasn't about winning. It was about sending a message. Lyra approached, her eyes flicking toward the distant figure of Zhar'tok, who had already retreated into the shadows. "Do you think he learned anything? That he'll stop?" Jax paused. "I don't know. People like him, they don't learn overnight. But maybe he'll think twice next time." The quiet between them lingered for a moment before Lyra spoke again, her voice softer now. "I didn't think humans were like that, so strong." Jax met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "We don't get to choose our strength, Lyra. We just survive. And sometimes that means showing the galaxy exactly what we're capable of." Her brow furrowed slightly. "And what's that?" "Resilience," Jax replied simply. "The ability to keep going even when the odds are stacked against you. The universe is full of beings that see strength in different ways. Some see it in power, some in intelligence, others in sheer force of will. But humans? We've got all three." Lyra's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no mockery in it. Just recognition. "I've never seen anything like it," she said. "You didn't fight Zhar'tok the way others would have. You outlasted him." Jax didn't respond at first, but there was a brief flicker in his eyes. He had been the underdog before, back on Earth, where everything was a fight for survival. That was what had shaped him, more than anything else. In the face of overwhelming odds, humanity had learned to adapt, to endure. As they stood there, the last of the spectators began to disperse, their conversations filled with murmurs about the duel. Jax watched them go, his thoughts returning to the larger picture. This wasn't just about him or Zhar'tok, it was about humans proving themselves in a galaxy that often overlooked them. "That's the thing about humanity," Jax said after a beat. "We don't fit into any one mold. We aren't always the strongest, but we're never the weakest either. We've got something they don't understand." Lyra tilted her head. "And what's that?" "Heart." A pause hung in the air. Then, as if the weight of his words had settled into her, Lyra spoke again. "So, what now?" Jax turned toward the exit of the arena, his shoulders relaxed but still firm with purpose. "Now, I wait. And I make sure no one underestimates me, or any human, ever again." They walked side by side out of the arena, the sounds of distant chatter filling the space between them. Jax could feel the eyes of the remaining students on him, some of them still processing the fight they'd just witnessed. There was no celebrating, no victory lap. He wasn't the type for that. But Jax knew one thing: the Vrexians, and everyone else in this academy, would remember today. It was hard to predict if Zhar'tok would come back for revenge, or if he would leave this battle behind. But Jax had made one thing clear: the next time someone dared to challenge a human, they'd know exactly who they were dealing with. The rest of the day passed in a blur, the academy resuming its usual activities, but something had shifted. Jax could feel it in the air, the faintest change. Maybe it was just the way the students looked at him now, some with fear, others with respect. But Jax didn't care for either. He wasn't here to win a popularity contest. He was here to survive, to protect, and to show the universe that humans were not to be underestimated. As evening fell and the academy lights flickered on, Jax found himself back at his quarters. He stood at the small window, looking out at the stars. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel something rare that had been buried deep inside him for years. It was satisfaction, yes, but more than that, it was the certainty that humanity had earned a place among the stars. Jax turned away from the window, his hand resting on the doorframe. He knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges, more misunderstandings, more bullies. But that was fine. He was ready for whatever came next. After all, if humanity had learned anything from their death world, anything at all, it was this: they would always rise, no matter how many times they were knocked down. And as long as Jax had breath in his lungs, he would make sure the galaxy remembered that. The door clicked shut behind him, and the quiet of the academy once again settled over the stars.